I want to welcome you to the most remarkable journey you will ever take. We have long wondered about the mysteries behind the resurrection of the dead, or the transformation of human to divine. We have asked ourselves these questions. Why am I human? Where are we going as a human race? Why did God create us? In these next 26 weeks, we're going to learn the answers to these questions. We're also going to learn about the powers that lie within us, that creativity that enables us to prophesy, to heal, and to discern. Our sailing vessel that will take us from earth to the heavens is known and called the Nautilus. If you remember, the sea creature is one which always closes and seals off its chambers as it outgrows it and builds a new one. And we must do the same thing. For we must cease being what we are in order to become something different. And like the Nautilus, we must leave behind our old ideas and concepts. So please join me on this very wondrous journey. I'm your hostess, Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows. Welcome to another adventure aboard the Nautilus. This is our last adventure in this series, The Secret Destiny of America. And somehow that seems a very applicable place to end it, because years ago I started my initiations, which included my first United States tour, and it ended at the feet of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty, by the way, was given to America, of course, by France, and was instigated by one of my ancestors, the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought with his soldiers side by side General George Washington. One of the things that very few people know is that General George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson were all Masons, as also was my grandfather, the Marquis de Lafayette. And these were the forefathers who established the foundation of a nation based upon natural and cosmic law. Through this series, we have followed the mysteries of the pyramid, and we have found that the pyramid signified the desolation of man as he stands in the desert, not yet having raised that divine nature in him, or in other words, the capstone for the pyramid. And that the Great Pyramid itself was, of course, a mystery school. And we're probably going to see that just a little bit as we journey into this final destiny of America. From the pyramids of Egypt, of course, we went into the teachings of Moses. These are found in another series, with the Ark of the Covenant and certainly the Tabernacle in the Wilderness. And the Tabernacle in the Wilderness followed these same principles. It was divided into three compartments. The outside, of course, being that for the multitude, and that was called the court. From the court you entered into the room called the Room of the Holies. And this held in it the seven-pronged candlestick, incense, and of course primarily the 12 loaves of shewbread. Then curtained off was the Ark of the Covenant in that third and final compartment. And this, of course, represented the body of man, or the body of God, the body of the Spirit. And the soul is signified by the Room of the Holy, and that great spiritual nature inside of us, that same capstone, is also caught, if we might say that, in the Ark of the Covenant. For all this time, while people look and search for the Ark of the Covenant, it too is within them, just as is the capstone of the pyramid. I think of all the people that have passed through the transformational change over the thousands and thousands of years, beginning with, of course, Zarathustra, which was about 6,000 years ago, the great Persian sage who brought forth the idea and concept of utilization and communion with the forces of nature. This included in his Art of Asha, the war or inner war that takes place between that of our darkness and unknowingness and that of our light. And constantly, of course, light is always overcoming our darkness and unknowingness. The mysteries from Zarathustra was really passed down to Egypt. They were found in one of the great pharaohs of Egypt, which was Akhenaten. While many in history claim Akhenaten to be mentally imbalanced, one who may be somewhat familiar with the mysteries as you have studied them here in these weeks that have passed will realize that Akhenaten was trying to bring forth the one God concept, that he was the first pharaoh in Egypt wanting to abolish the multi-gods. Of course, this was to cost him his life. Along with the Pharaoh, of course, of Egypt, the Great Pyramid as a mystery school, two very great initiates came out of this. That was, of course, Hermes, and we took a look at the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. And the other one, of course, was Moses, which Moses came down much through the Christian world, and Hermes probably kind of set in motion those things of the Eastern world. We're not saying that he was the founder of Hindu philosophy or the ancient philosophy of India, but we are simply saying that he is not as well known in our Western world, of course, as what Moses is. And of course, countries throughout time have held the key to the mysteries. I'm not quite sure what we should call this. There just seems to come a time through the ages when a country here and there happens to bring forth the great illumined and the great enlightened people of mankind, those that pass through this transformational change. We have found this very heavily among the Christian mystics also, such as Beethoven and, of course, Emerson and Longfellow, Whitman, the great like artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. We also found it in modern people like Jacques Cousteau and Einstein. And in this book of Cosmic Consciousness, which was written by Richard Buck, and we have mentioned this book before, he brings in the talking about this plane of self-consciousness to cosmic consciousness, and honors in his writing some of those people who did enter into cosmic consciousness, and he talks about their detailed explanation of this. We have such people, of course, as Gautama Buddha, Zarathustra, Muhammad, Francis Bacon of England, as we go on, Balzac, Walt Whitman, Edward Carpenter, and some of them that you might not be quite as familiar with, such as Pascal and Spinoza, although they're very common names. These were all people that went through this remarkable metamorphosis that we have been talking about for so many weeks. Again, as I have stressed so many times, this same seed of greatness is in you, and all you have to do is to bring it forth. And you do this through devotional surrender to God, meaning your meditation, your study, sharing your life with God, and being one who serves Him, that you will try to make this a better world to live in. We don't have to be famous to be great. Greatness is something that is inside. Greatness is our ability to love and to have compassion and understanding. Someday, sometime, however, we will also have the fame. When the ego has been ground to whiteness and purity, when it no longer stands in the way where we will use it for this power for aggrandizement, then we will be allowed our moment of glory upon the winds of time, and we too will be a Balzac or a Spinoza or a Gautama Buddha or a Beethoven or Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. So as I mentioned, these countries, one by one throughout history, this great light bearing forth master initiates or illumined people has happened in various times throughout the ages. We've already talked about Egypt, the time of the Great Pyramid, the coming forth of two great masters, really a lot more, because all of those seeking the mysteries of life went to Egypt to study Karnak, Luxor, Carmel, and even into the deserts. So Egypt was the real great spiritual capital of the world. It was here that master initiates in the world of philosophy and science, mathematics, and music came in order to enter into the great mystery schools. Probably among those, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, in my estimation, of course, was Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates. From Egypt, it seemed to have gathered itself into the East. And for many centuries, the East brought forth some of the greatest masters the world has ever known. And I'm reminded here, when I think of masters of the East, of something that Swami Chinmayananda once said. He was giving a discourse, and he happened to mention that all the great masters came from the East. Of course, someone raised their hand and said, but what about Jesus? And Swami looked at them so seriously, and he said, Jesus was of the East. I thought about this afterwards and realized that Swamiji was right, that Jesus' training had come from the East. It was not a common thing for there to be a master and disciple relationship in the country of Israel. I'm not saying that he got his illumination from the East. No, no, no. But I am saying that the principle of master-disciple was traditionally of the East, and not something that was a commonality in Israel. But so even Jesus, it is reported, of course, and certainly the letter from Jesus' mother, or that Jesus wrote his mother that brought him out of Egypt into Israel, indicates that he definitely was in Egypt. Then he too traveled to where the great mystery schools were, and probably learned more as well as taught. That then the death of Joseph, and the time had come for him to fulfill his mission, so he came forth from Egypt into Israel, and with it he brought the mysteries. So India produced not only India itself, but Persia. Some of the great sages, such as Orpheus, who spoke of the great hymns and did the great invocations or evoking of these great and powerful forces, not counting some of the great, the many Greek philosophers that we have read throughout the ages. But there's Greece, there's Persian, there's, of course, certainly India itself, that really ruled over the land and brought forth so many illumined and enlightened people. From the time, however, or rather a short time before Jesus' advent and a short time afterwards, of course, the great sages of China bore the mysteries. You're all familiar, I'm certain, with Tao and Lao Tzu and Chung Tzu and Confucius, who were also great illumined people and brought forth the teachings in that part of the country. And that was known as the days of the great part of the ages of the great Eastern mystics. Then Israel became the queen city, because it was Jesus who taught his disciples, and quite a number of his disciples, although not all of them, became illumined. Among his most illumined, of course, was Paul, John the Baptist, John the Beloved, all great illumined people of that time. So Israel, Jerusalem particularly, was looked upon as the queen city of the world. After Jerusalem, Israel, of course, the sages of China also came into play, and China held on for a long time of bringing forth some of the great philosophers. We didn't think of them as religionists or scientists, but more as philosophers. Sages, seers, the Tibetan lamas. It was a great age, and then everything seemed to kind of go silent for a while. And then about in the mid-1800s, a new nation came into bloom, and it was England. England then produced some of the greatest mystics of all times. England, Germany, through that part of the country, brought forth their sages and masters. One of them, of course, Sir Francis Bacon, who is probably the most well-known, perhaps because of his writings on Atlantis, the knowledge or pre-knowledge of the existence of America. The old countries began to become seeped in tradition. This is always happens. It is like anyone's writing. We can take Jesus' teachings, for instance, as he taught them 2,000 years ago, and we can look at them today and know that they have been modified and remodified until some of the original glory of the teachings and understanding of them has varied. For instance, between the first century Aramaic of the Bible and the current one, there are over 832 discrepancies. For instance, one chapter says Jesus wears a scarlet robe, another one a purple robe at the crucifixion. It doesn't make any difference what the color of robe was. I'm just simply saying there's over 832 distinct differences between first century Aramaic and the Bible that we know today. So the same thing happens with a country. They become set in their ways, and patterns begin to form, and it becomes harder to bring new things into a nation, simply because people do not want to accept the new. You have to remember some of the great astronomers, such as Copernicus and Galileo, and how they were called heretics because they said that our world was not the center of the universe, and that the sun, that we rotated around the sun, and how the church fathers was not going to have that, because here was a special planet, and God had put his only begotten Son on this single planet, which he'd built in 7 days, although every other planet in the vast millions of galaxies took millions of years to evolve. So the church fathers were not going to have such statements made. So it becomes, these countries become not stagnant, but just becomes very brittle and difficult to move greater truths into the minds of the people. Now, people like Christopher Columbus and certainly Sir Francis Bacon, others called the Great Illuminati. There were, to my understanding, two groups of Illuminati, one which was really illumined and one which wasn't, and so there has always been a controversy over this. But the great Illuminati of Europe knew that they had to have a new place to build truth, that they had to establish a new frontier if the truths were going to live. They knew of the existence of America, and I have no doubt that they knew of its existence simply because anyone with any measure of intuitive ability would know there was a land beyond the sea. It was said at one time that there was even a colony formed here, and I can't tell you whether that is true or not. I only know that it was chosen that they would go to this land across the sea. Sir Francis Bacon writes about it in his writings called New Atlantis Rising. And the New Atlantis Rising is a story that about a ship that finds its way to America, and interestingly enough, he spelled it with a K rather than with a C, and that in this new America would be the new Atlantis. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fable of Atlantis, but it really started with Plato, when Plato is telling his teacher Socrates the story about the god Poseidon, who was known as god of the ocean. And the gods, there were a multitude of gods, god of the sea, god of land, god of the moon, and so on. And so the god of the gods decided to distribute parcels of land to each one of the gods. It fell upon the god Poseidon to have Atlantis. And so Poseidon descended to live in mortal embodiment. And he raised this country to be very great and powerful, and to have all of the things, such the culture like music and art. So powerful did Atlantis become that it wanted more than what it had. So it warred against its nation. This made Poseidon so angry that he sunk Atlantis beneath the sea. And of course, this was the story as Socrates is telling, as Plato is telling his teacher Socrates. And what he is actually revealing here is not about an actual landmass which has sunk, but the spiritual nature which comes forth upon the land. And that Poseidon, god of the sea, means the land coming out of if you remember back in the very beginning of this course, when we said that the earth was covered with water simply because the hot molten mass flowing in outer space produced heavy rains and cooled the surface of the earth. So this was the god Poseidon. And then as man became more and more powerful and developed his reasoning power, he began to fight with his neighbor. And thus it was that his great spiritual nature lied buried beneath the sea. And of course it's talked about that Atlantis will rise again, not some landmass off in the sea, but in reality this great divine nature will again one day come forth upon the surface of the earth, and man will live, the brotherhood of man will come, and peace shall reign upon the earth. And so that's the new Atlantis rising. And the forefathers, or the ancestors of our forefathers, looked toward this country of America to see if they could build a colony or some place where once again the freedoms would exist for mankind. And so we're going to take a look at some of the things. This book, The Secret Destiny of America by Manly P. Hall, is a wonderful book and should be read by every American citizen. It can be obtained in libraries, probably online at Amazon.com, but it's Manly P. Hall, H-A-L-L. He wrote over 80 books, and he wrote The Secret Teachings of All Ages before he was 28 years old. And it is such a massive, heavy book that one can hardly lift it. I have used it for research, but to read it through word by word, I'm afraid would not be quite that exciting. So I have one thing, I have no reason to doubt Manly P. Hall. He was impeccable in his research. He was an illumined man who had born this great light. He was a philosopher and also had one of the largest libraries containing the ancient mysteries of the ages, probably of anyone in the United States or perhaps any single individual in the world. He has the Philosophical Research Society in California, or he did have. He has now, of course, left the embodiment. But because he was so familiar with the mysteries, and he was one of my three great teachers, I have complete respect for this book and have no doubt about it. I think one of the things that we'll start with first here is something he says in the beginning of this book. He said, "World democracy was the secret dream of the great classical philosophers. Thousands of years before Columbus, they were aware of the existence of our Western Hemisphere and selected it to be the site of a philosophic empire. The brilliant plan of the ancients has survived to our time, and it will continue to function until the great work is accomplished. The American nation desperately needs a vision of its own purpose. For as England once held the light, and the sages of China, Israel, Egypt, India, Greece, Rome, Persia, the destiny of America is it's our turn now to hold the lights. And the coming masters are being born and brought forth here in America." We go to a vision of here. This was the great vision of Sir William Hope. I think most of you are familiar about him. And the Congressional Library at Washington, D.C. is a curious little book entitled Vindication of the True Art of Self-Defense. It is a work on fencing and dueling published in 1724 by Sir William Hope, Bart, a deputy governor of Edinburgh Castle. In this copy, facing the title page, an engraving has been inserted of the badge of the Royal Society of Swordsmen. Underneath it is written Private Library of Sir William Hope. The Library of Congress has had this book since 1879. And it isn't so much that the book has any value to you, it's more that Sir William Hope wrote in the margins, in his own handwriting, he wrote certain things, notes, if we can call them that, prophecies, which he wrote in the margins of the book. And so here are some of them. Little information is available concerning Sir William Hope, but from the text of his prediction, it appears that he was devoted to the study of astrology, and based on his strange prophetic poem upon an interpretation of starry influences. There is a hint of Kabbalah in the manner used by Hope to indicate the men referred to in his prediction. And of course, when I think of Kabbalah, the Hebrew Kabbalah, I want also to explain that Pythagoras long ago said that everything could be explained in numbers. As we took a look at the measurements of the Pyramid of Egypt, and if we were to take a look at those same measurements of the tabernacle in the wilderness, as we did in Covenant of Sinai, then you would find that always numbers reveal everything. We can take your name or the date of your birth. We can do this by numbers and tell you exactly what you came here to learn, exactly what your purpose in life is, and exactly what your obstacles are. And you might not think we could get that all from your name, but we can. Because numbers are, as Pythagoras said, numbers are immutable. So therefore, Pythagoras, who existed before we had Hebrew Kabbalah, simply those numbers flowed down from clear probably from the ancient time of the Persian sage of Zarathustra. And so the prophecy of Sir William Hope begins with these lines. "'Tis Chaldee, says fate is great, whose stars do bear him fortunate. Of thy near fate, America," and again America is spelled with a K, as it had been done in, as we talked about earlier. "I read in stars a prophecy. 14 divided, 12 the same. 16 in halves, each holds a name. 4, 8, 7, 6, added 10. The lifeline's mark of 4 great men." From the text, the prophecy covers the period from 1732 to 1901. From the history of our country during this period of time, Hope selected 4 men, and the numbers which he used to indicate them are shown as the prophecy unfolds. He summarizes the lives of these 4 men by totaling the number of years that each lived. He does this in the line 4, 8, 7, 6, added 10. 4 plus 8 plus 7 plus 6 equals 25. The added 10 is a cipher for making a total of 250. At the time of his death, George Washington was 68, Abraham Lincoln 56, Benjamin Harris 68, and William McKinley 58. The total of these years is 250 years. The next 12 lines are devoted to a description of George Washington and the struggle of the American colonies for independence. One day is cradled far beyond the sea, one starred by fate to rule both bond and free. The prophecy is dated 1732. And in that year, George Washington was born beyond the sea in Virginia. The reference to bond and free is believed to indicate that slavery would exist during Washington's time in the colony of Virginia. Add double 4, thus fix the destined date. When servile knees unbend 'neath freedom's sway. By double 4, we read 44, which, if added to the date of 1732, gives the year of 1776, the year of America's Declaration for Independence. Place 6, 4, 10, then read the patriot's name, whose deeds shall link him to a deathless fame. At double 4, thus fix the destined day. There are 6 letters in the name George and 10 in Washington. And this Kabbalah, when added to the previous and subsequent descriptions, can leave no doubt as to the man intended in the prophecy, whose growing love and ceaseless trust wrong none, and catch truth's color from its glowing sun. Death's door shall clang while yet his century waits. His planets point the way to others' pending fate. The lines contain not only a glowing tribute, but an exact bit of prophecy. Washington died on December 14th, 1799, just 17 days before his country passed into history. Till all the names of freedom's scroll shall fade, 2 tombs be built, his lofty cenotaph be made. Freedom's scroll is the Declaration of Independence, which is now carefully preserved under yellow cellophane because the signatures have begun to fade. The body of George Washington has rested in 2 tombs. His lofty cenotaph, the Washington Monument, is 555 feet high, the tallest memorial ever constructed to the memory of a man. Full 6 times 10, the years must onward glide. Nature, their potent help, a constant, prudent guide. The 6 times 10 years, or 60 years, be added to the date of the death of Washington. The result is 1859, when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry and was hanged for attempting to incite a slave revolt, a circumstance leading directly to the United States of America engaging in the Great Civil War to preserve the freedom of all people. Then fateful 747 shall reign heroic sun, whom Mars and Jupiter strike down before his work is done. When cruel fate shall pierce through artless of its sword, who leaves life's gloomy stage with one farewell word, a softly beaming star half veiled by Mars' red cloud, virtue his noblest cloak shall form a fitting shroud. There are 7 letters in Abraham and 7 letters in Lincoln. He is a heroic son, elected to the presidency in 1860, re-elected in 1864, and assassinated April 14, 1865. He was indeed struck down before his work was done, for slavery was not abolished by constitutional amendment till the end of that year, and the Civil War was not proclaimed to be at an end until August 20, 1866. The reference to life's gloomy stage is more extraordinary because Lincoln was assassinated at the Ford Theater while watching a play, and he never spoke again after the assassin's bullet struck him, though he lived for several hours. References to President Benjamin Harrison are contained in the following 2 lines. When 848, a later generation rules, with light undimmed and shed in progress. There were 8 letters in Benjamin, 8 in Harrison. He ruled a later generation, 1889 to 1893. His administration was justly climaxed by the Great Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And there is more, a little bit more to to these prophecies that was found here, but I don't think there's anything that perhaps is terribly important that we would be that interested in. But this world of prophecy has existed throughout time, and here is such an example of one of those great illumined people who lived on the other side of the sea, who knew that the secret destiny of America was to bring forth the light of mankind. We go from there to something that happened with General McClellan. It was a prophetic dream of General McClellan. I believe we have all had prophetic dreams from time to time. And what I have noticed about my own is that they don't happen exactly as they may appear in the dream. So we have a tendency sometimes to brush them off. And it is the very vivid dreams that are something that we should pay attention to. The vision of Constantine changed the course of the Roman Empire, for instance. You remember Constantine is riding with his army at high noon, and suddenly there's a vision in the sky, and here is a great cross. And when Constantine sees this, he is certain that it is a message from God that he is to become a Christian nation. So Constantine turned Asia Minor, the Asian Empire, into Christianity. And so Joan of Arc, and the powerful vision that came to General McClellan was a force of preserving the union of the American people. The story of General McClellan's dream, preserved in the general's own words, seemed to have appeared in print the first time in Portland, Maine, the Evening Courier, March 8 in 1862. Had the story not been true, it's almost certain that McClellan himself would have made some statement of disapproval or demanded a retraction. General McClellan's career as a soldier was not exceptionally brilliant. He was a good organizer, and he made many enemies, but he had laid a plan of attack for the subsequent day in which they expected to do battle. So at 2 o'clock on the 3rd night, after General McClellan's arrival in Washington, D.C. to take command of the United States Army, he was working over his maps and studying the reports of the scouts. A feeling of intense weariness came over him, and leaning his forehead on his folded arm, he fell asleep at the table. He had not been sleeping more than 10 minutes when it seemed that the locked door of his room was suddenly thrown open, and someone strode up to him, and a voice terrible with power spoke. "General McClellan, do you sleep at your post? Rouse you, or ere it can be prevented, the foe will be in Washington." The general then describes to some measure these strange feelings that he had. And at the moment he seemed to be suspended in the center of infinite space. And the voice came from a hollow distance about him. He started up, but whether he was really awake, he wasn't able to decide. I think it's always very fascinating when these things take place, because the body, you see, our true state of existence is not here upon earth. It is in this world that exists beyond earth. While we are caught in this dense body, then we are aware only of the tangible things of earth. But if we were to take this body off, we would be also aware of the intangible substance. And it is in this state that is our permanent existence. In other words, we have always lived. We put upon ourselves a body, we take off a body, we put on another one, and each time we grow and progress. So this is not our natural state of existence. Sometimes, for one reason or another, the indwelling spirit brings us into full consciousness while we are not in the body. And when this happens, everything is just as real, of course, as it is if we were in embodiment. And it's very hard to distinguish in that conscious state whether we are actually upon earth or in the more subtle ethers. And it's unlikely that he was awake in the sense that we think of being awake, but that he'd been brought into full consciousness in order to be aware of what was being told him. The table covered with maps was still before him, but the furniture, the walls of the room, and other familiar objects were no longer visible. Instead, he was gazing upon a living map, including the entire area of the country from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. McClellan tried to see the features of the being that stood with him, but could discern nothing but a vapor having a general outline of a man. And that's usually when I talk about the materialization of one of the great masters from the other side, or seeing my own teacher. It is usually very subtle like that also. McClellan tried to see the features of the being that stood before him. As he looked upon the great map, he was amazed to see the movements of the various troops and regiments, the complete pattern of the enemy line, and the distribution of the forces. The general was immediately infused with a great elation, for he felt that the movement on this extraordinary map would enable him to bring the war to a speedy and victorious termination. Then his elation changed to great apprehension. He saw the enemy forces moving to certain points which he himself had intended to occupy within the next few days. He quietly realized that in some way his plans were known to the enemy. Then again the voice spoke. "General McClellan, you have been betrayed. And had God not willed otherwise, ere the sun of tomorrow had set, the Confederate flag would have waved above the Capitol and your own grave. But note what you see. Your time is short." His pencil moved with the speed of thought. McClellan transferred the troop position from the living map to the paper map on his desk. When this had been done, McClellan became aware that the figure standing near him had increased in light and glory until it shone like the noonday sun. And as he raised his eyes, he looked into the face of General George Washington. The first president was sublime with gentle dignity, looked upon the bewildered officer, and spoke as follows. "General McClellan, while yet in the flesh I beheld the birth of the American public. It was indeed a hard and bloody one, but God's blessing was upon the nation, and therefore through this, her first great struggle for existence, he sustained her, and his mighty hand brought her out triumphantly. A century has not passed since then, and yet the child republic has taken her position, a peer with nations whose pages of history extend for ages into the past. She has, since those dark days, by the favor of God, greatly prospered. And now, by the very reason of this prosperity, she has been brought to her second great struggle. This is by far the most perilous ordeal she has to endure. Passing as she is from childhood to open maturity, she is called on to accomplish that vast result, self-conquest, to learn the important lesson, self-control, self-rule, that in the future will place her in the van of the power of civilization. But her mission will not be finished, for ere another century shall have gone by. The oppressors of the whole earth, hating and envying her exaltation, shall join themselves together and raise their hands against her. But if she still be found worthy of her high calling, they shall surely be discomfited, and then will be ended her third and great struggle for existence. The spirit visitor ceased speaking. He raised his hands over McClellan in blessing, and the next instant a peal of thunder rumbled through space, and McClellan woke. But there was one difference. The maps were covered with marks, signs, and figures, which he had inscribed during his vision. And of course, had General George Washington not come to McClellan that night, there would not be America today. Our forefathers sought to bring forth one nation under God, building it and establishing it on natural and cosmic law, as had Moses done before. The Statue of Liberty brought over by France signifies this, for she represents the cloaked figure of the woman in the mysteries, Isis. She bears 7 crowns, 7 points in the crown, representing 7 epochs of creation. When I talk about the shrouded covering of Isis, the Statue of Liberty means her mystery has not been revealed. She is the mother bringing forth the birth of a new light upon the world, which is so symbolized by Isis bringing forth Horus, or the divine spark of God from the womb of mortality, as each of us must do. So the mother has brought forth a new nation, which would represent the 7th epoch of creation, the enlightened age of man, and she holds her torch high. The torch is light, that all might see, and all might come to her to build what? A united nation. Not just for Americas, but as a light to the whole of earth. Even our dollar bill is one of the great symbols of the awareness that General George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin had, and Patrick Henry. These were illumined people who had also passed through this transformation of human to divine, who was born into this nation to bring it forth and to give it a freedom. The dollar bill would stand as a unity of the 4 elements. One is found in each corner. Here in this particular great seal, there are 72 stones representing the 2 cells would be raised in the 7th and final epoch of creation, and the capstone of the pyramid, which is the all-seeing eye of God, would once again be united as the 2 cells were united into oneness. In God we trust. I think I would not like to leave this without just reading through one more thing, the unknown that swayed the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was so hot on that day of the 4th of July. There was talk of gibbets and axes and dying and death, and There was hesitancy because the forefathers knew that if they signed the Declaration of Independence, they might be dead by evening. According to Jefferson, it was late in the afternoon before the delegates gathered their courage to a sticking point. The talk was of axes, scaffolds, and gibbets, when suddenly a strong, bold voice sounded, "Gibbet." And a figure stood up. "Gibbet, they may stretch our necks on all the gibbets of the land. They may turn every rock into a scaffold, every tree into a gallows, every home into a grave. And yet the words of that parchment can never die. They may pour our blood on 1,000 scaffolds, and yet from every drop that dies the axe a new champion of freedom will spring into birth. The British king may blot out the stars of God from the sky, but he cannot blot out his words written on that parchment there. The works of God may perish, his words never. The words on this declaration will live in the world long after our bones are dust. To the mechanic in his workshop they will speak hope. To the slave in the mines, freedom. But to the coward kings these words will speak in tones of warning they cannot choose but hear. Sign that parchment, sign. Sign if the next moment the gibbet rope is about your neck. Sign if the next minute this hall rings with the clash of falling axes. Sign by all your hopes in life or death, as men, as husbands, as fathers, brothers. Sign your name to the parchment, or be accursed forever. Sign, and not only for yourselves, but for all ages, for that parchment will be the textbook of freedom, the Bible of the rights of men forever. Nay, do not start and whisper with surprise. It is truth. Your own hearts witness it. God proclaims it. Look at this strange band of exiles and outcasts, suddenly transformed into a people, a handful of men, weak in arms, but mighty in godlike faith. Nay, look at your recent achievements, your Bunker Hill, your Lexington, and then tell me, if you can, that God has not given America to be free. It is not given to our poor human intellect to climb to the skies and to pierce the counsel of the Almighty One, but methinks I stand among the awful clouds which veil the brightness of Jehovah's throne. Methinks I see the recording angel come trembling up to that throne and speak his dread message. Father, the old world is baptized in blood. Father, look with one glance at thine eternal eye, and behold evermore the terrible sight, man trodden beneath the oppressor's feet, nations lost in blood and murder and superstition, walking hand in hand over the graves of the victim, and not a single voice of hope to man. Yes, as I sank into the gloomy shadows of the grave with my last faint whisper, I would beg you to sign that parchment for the sake of those millions whose very breath is hushed in intense expectation as they look up to you for the awful words, "You are free." The unknown speaker fell exhausted into his seat. The delegates, carried by his enthusiasm, rushed forward. John Hancock scarcely had time to pen his bold signature before the quill was grasped by another. It was done when they turned to thank the man. He was not there. I want to thank you for joining us on this special journey aboard the Nautilus, which has taken us from Earth to heaven. If you have any questions or wish to be on our mailing list, please call area code 206-362-4134. Area code 206-362-4134. 834. Or join us on our website, Mystery School, one word, mysteryschool.org. The God in me bows to the God in you, and may heaven walk with you all week.